Okay, Ken Greenberg wrote a book recently called Walking Home, which I read, and he signed it for me this morning, which is nice. He grew up in Brooklyn, and he lives in Toronto, and he's been involved in Detroit, and he's been involved in various, Detroit, yes. Very good. Anyway, he's a serious urbanist. He spoke at the CNU in Toronto, which I believe was in 1997. He is happy to be associated with New Urbanists and with CNU, but he also has his own identity as an urbanist. He is closely connected with people that are sometimes describe themselves as landscape urbanists, including Michael Van Valkenburg, who he works with on projects. And so he has a unique perspective, somebody who respects New Urbanism and CNU, but also has his own perspective. He also is in Toronto, which is close to Buffalo. And so he's seen Buffalo a lot, and he has some observations, I hope, about Buffalo, both in a good way and also in ways that suggest change. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce Ken Greenberg, who gave a very good talk that really advanced our discussions in Toronto, and now will do so here in Buffalo. And I'm very happy that he joined us this evening. Ken Greenberg.
John, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you, CNU, for inviting me to play this very important role to kick off this 22nd Congress. Mayors, county exec, and if we were in Canada, I would refer to you as your worships, as you probably know, which is a sign of the high esteem in which we hold municipal officials. There is, of course, one exception you may have heard of, but more about that later. I wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to set the stage by talking about what I think is the great promise of urbanism, but also some of the new and very serious challenges and responsibilities that are coming our way. When Doug Kelbaugh originally talked to me about taking part in the Congress, he suggested that one of the things I might like to talk about is some of the differences between the Canadian situation and the American situation, and I thought about that. In fact, in 2000 at Ohio State, I actually did a whole lecture on cross-border insights in which I was quite convinced that I understood those differences. The truth is it's become much more complicated now, and in fact there are both great similarities and great differences, so that for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to actually conflate the experiences across this border and talk about some of the common challenges that we're both facing. So what's going on here? The backstory is we are seeing a massive shift back to cities. It's at different stages, it's happening at different rates on different parts of the continent, but nonetheless, it is a very powerful phenomenon. And this is in relation to the previous 2.5 generations when we altered the urban face of North America with an exodus from cities and an exaggerated embrace of the automobile. And so now we're reacting to those consequences. So the two scenes you see here could be replicated in pretty much any city on the continent. That's Yonge Street in Toronto. There's a similar image in the Hyatt Hotel in the elevator of a great downtown scene in Buffalo prior to World War II. And then on the right, what you see is our aptly named Canadian department store called Canadian Tire, which was all about the exodus from the city, where the assumption was that driving could get you to everything you needed to do in life. And so we all went that way. What has followed is that we created a dominant paradigm, which I think we all understand now has tested to failure. This is a Life magazine cover from 1960. As quickly as we built those freeways, they of course filled up. We're now understanding the dramatic effects on climate change, which for the longest time we were either unaware of or denying. We've also done something to our bodies as a result of adopting that lifestyle, and particularly in the case of children, we're seeing levels of hypertension, of obesity, of heart disease that we had never seen before, and so public health officials are playing a major role in this discussion. And as if all of that were not enough, fracking notwithstanding, we've actually reached peak oil where we can see the limitations, or at least the rising costs of dependence on fossil fuels. So we're now well into what I would call round two. It's the aftershock, it's the reaction, and what is going on is that a second paradigm, which is as powerful as that paradigm that seized us all immediately after World War II, is underway, and that in effect is what I tried to write about in my book, Walking Home, drawing on experiences that I've had personally over the past several decades in cities across the continent. What has happened with that paradigm shift is that the American dream, which was so powerful not only amongst us but across the world, is actually giving way to a competing, more potent dream that reflects very different priorities. And essentially it comes down very simply for a younger generation or younger generations of people to being able to live in a neighborhood where you can walk to buy your groceries, where you have easy access to transit, where you can use a bicycle, where there's an entirely different kind of conviviality. So this is being tracked, of course, by the people who need to care about this. ULI, in an issue of its magazine America in 2013, was reporting to its members in the development industry that there's a very different set of priorities for the people who are consumers of their products. And in fact, in this study, which was done by the University of Michigan and appeared in the Wall Street Journal, you can see the progression over time through urban tribes with the medium or large city cohort, that population, the choice of a place to live growing ever larger, and a shrinking of the automobile-oriented options. In fact, in these two graphs from The Economist from about the same time, we see a really interesting pair of phenomena. On the one hand, something called demotorization, where throughout the developed world, the number of vehicle miles traveled annually is actually for the first time on the decrease. But really significantly, and I think most of us are aware of this now, the propensity to do what many of us in this room did when we turned 16 as a rite of passage, which was to race out and get your driver's license, has actually changed dramatically. So in the age cohort from 16 to 34, we now have 26% of that cohort who have chosen never to get a driver's license. This is a pretty stunning turnabout. And so the term mobility has an entirely different meaning for the young. It's about virtual connectivity, and that goes hand in hand with walkability. So you see, if you break down the age cohort even further, among 17-year-olds, there is a accelerating drop compared to 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 30-somethings in terms of that rush to get driver's licenses. And in fact, when people are making a decision about where to live, what they're doing is using something called Walk Score, where you get on your smartphone and you can see what you can do within a 5-minute walk of any location. And so it's interesting that 3 Canadian cities, Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, are among the top cities for the density of those blue arrows that you see on that diagram, all those needs of daily life within the 5-minute walk. So to the theme of this conference, the great good news is that cities and suburbs are proving to be remarkably resilient. And what we are doing, even for people who have never read The Death and Life of Great American Cities, we are collectively internalizing that key concept of organized complexity that Jane Jacobs brought to us from the biological sciences, which is leading to a much better understanding, an intuitive feeling for how cities actually work, more like ecosystems, in fact, than like the machines that the great planners of the early part of the 20th century like to emulate. So these are some images from St. Paul, Minnesota, where I worked for about a dozen years, just to illustrate that incredible resilience. So you see St. Paul sort of moving clockwise through these images from a peaking of the industrial era, what ecologists would call a climax, because the climax was already foretelling the decline, leading to a period when the city center was atrophying. It was hemorrhaging, losing jobs, losing population. The environment was despoiled. Much of it was turned over to surface parking lots. And then a revival as St. Paul reconnected itself to its heart, to the Mississippi River, its source, and has begun something that is now referred to as the St. Paul Renaissance. So the pushback typically follows this pattern. It starts in older neighborhoods, which had previously been rejected. And without knowing the details, I'm pretty sure that's the case here in Buffalo, that there are some terrific older neighborhoods that people have discovered, like these in Toronto, and are rejecting the notion of either fleeing or demolishing through urban renewal. But then the next step is it moves into older downtown areas that experience that parking lot phenomenon, or obsolescent industrial areas. And so this is where, when I began to work as the Director of Architecture and Urban Design for the City of Toronto with another great mayor, Mayor David Crombie, who is perhaps our most interesting mayor of the last 100 years, that the scene on the left is what that shoulder of downtown Toronto looked like. It was about 75% parking lots and a few buildings left here and there. And of course, what you see on the right is what it looks like today. There is not a single surface parking lot left. It's all been entirely repopulated. And so, you know, a little homage to Buffalo and the work that Mayor Brown and the staff are doing here as part of the rusty to radiant transformation. A very similar phenomenon. It's perhaps at a different stage, but it is inevitably taking the same course. In the heart of downtown, of course, the return to the waterfront, certain clusters like the medical cluster leading a revival, the reoccupation of obsolescent industrial areas, and so on. Now, a next step is the reappropriation of all that massive mid-20th century infrastructure, and I pictured the intersection that John Norquist made reference to, and you all saw Mayor Brown go thumbs up. So this is I-190 and the Skyway right in the heart of Buffalo, but we were having a parallel discussion in Toronto, just across the lake, about the elevated Gardiner Expressway, where it joins the Don Valley Parkway, and on the right images, you see plans that are being very actively discussed for reappropriating the massive land area occupied by that interchange, creating new neighborhoods, new employment that will be served by transit, not by automobiles. And you can see in the cross sections at the bottom the difference that that can make. There is another transformation going on, and this is my little plug for Ellen Dunham Jones and her terrific book, Retrofitting Suburbia, which is on a parallel track, and this is perhaps the biggest redesign and redevelopment project of the next 50 years, which is taking these areas where 2/3 of North Americans now live and transforming them. So on the right is an image from what we call the 905. It's the telephone exchange on the outskirts of Toronto, two municipalities, Markham and Richmond Hill, who are actively engaged in this transformation. And you see across the 407 highway, a major highway, these two areas that are wired to 5 modes of transit: an extension of the subway, our GO train, our commuter rail, bus rapid transit, local buses, and of course active transportation, with very ambitious plans that are being realized to urbanize these suburban areas. Here is Mississauga, just to the west of Toronto, led by Hazel McCallion, who has been a mayor for over 30 years. She's in her 90s now and still going as strong as ever. She has gone from being the queen of suburbia, the queen of sprawl, to being one of our great urbanist mayors. And in fact, you see a regional shopping center, Mississauga Square 1, as it was created 50 years ago in a farmer's field, and on the right, now surrounded by tens of thousands of people living in a dense urban setting, and on the bottom left, a new light rail line, new bus rapid transit, which are coming to enable the colonization of all those acres of parking lot into a plan that I worked on with Gladding Jackson. I don't know if anybody from Gladding is here today, but this is for transforming that whole area into something that's happening all across the continent, which is a mixed-use set of neighborhoods based on streets and blocks. So all this sounds very positive, but the truth is, if we're really honest, we are both succeeding and failing at the same time. If only it were this easy, if we had one of these on our computers. The big picture is we are at a critical tipping point. We've accumulated a lot of great individual examples of success, and the next big challenge is how do we move from these exceptions to tackle the rule? And this is like turning an aircraft carrier. I am kind of quoting Dwight Eisenhower here with his admonition about the military-industrial complex. In fact, we have a deeply ingrained sprawl industrial complex, if you like. It consists of financial institutions, developers, lawyers, builders, brokers, real estate agents, road contractors, all across North America, who have organized themselves to do, in fact, what we ask them to do. We in the planning professions, and they do it extremely well. And to unravel this and change this touches on everything. It touches on politics at all levels. It touches on economics, social, cultural values, our communities, and finally, individual choices. So to look at nearby Hamilton, again, not far from where we're sitting now, we have this wonderful pocket called James Street North, which is right next to the revival of the commuter rail that will provide all-day service to Toronto, one of the older neighborhoods that's experiencing just the kind of rebirth that I was describing. A block or two away, you see the scene on the right, and then if you look on the outskirts of town, you see the scene on the bottom. And this is all happening simultaneously. We are operating, in effect, at cross purposes. So there are two ways you can look at this in terms of following the money. Christopher Leinberger of the Brookings Institution has done some really interesting work going upstream from the developers, whom we often like to blame to the financial institutions where they have to go to get their funding. And in fact, as he points out, when Wall Street got involved in development, they treated it like derivatives. And they, in fact, came up with 19 standard product types, which are like what you see here on this child's plate with the ridges. They were things that could never touch each other. Each was discrete and specific, and in order to get funding, developers had to fall into one of these 19 categories, and they were almost entirely automobile-oriented categories. So that has not yet been dismantled, although there's some moves in that direction. If you follow the money publicly, and here is a book by one of my colleagues, economist Pamela Bley, called Perverse Cities. In fact, and I think we all are aware of this, there are tremendous hidden subsidies and incentives on the public side that are the enablers of that continued sprawl. So my point is we have to go upstream on both the public and private sides to deal with this seriously. In fact, what we're doing is producing city regions that are still largely auto-dependent. And here is some work done by David Gordon from Queen's University, who is a CNU member and teaches at Queen's University. And he pointed out in a very interesting study done recently that if you look at Toronto, within the pre-war city, 68% of the growth is in active cores and transit-oriented areas. But if you step outside that into the 905 that I described to you before, 99% of the growth that's occurring is in auto and ex-urban areas. This is still going on. So we're congratulating ourselves on all the terrific things that are happening, but this is the reality. Every city that I have worked in recently has some version of this plan from Saskatoon in Saskatchewan, which is a plan of where the growth is going to occur. And in fact, let me say not city, city region, because this goes right out to the edge of the urban periphery. So what you see in the light yellow color are all of the greenfield sites along prospective highways that are under consideration and some level of approval for sprawl. Throughout the middle of the map in orange are all the infill sites that have been identified, which are very significant, which could handle the growth if it were concentrated in a more urban form. And yet, in city after city after city, or city region after city region, we are schizophrenic. We're doing both at the same time. The backdrop for this, and it's an epic struggle, is that there are major new economic, political, and social challenges which have emerged to the urban project. Some of them are internal, but many of them, in fact, are externalities. And we can't ignore, for example, the impact of globalization with the precipitous loss of manufacturing jobs that occurs from around 2000 to the present. This is tied absolutely to the phenomenon of polarization. The fact that up until, from the end of World War II, up until about 1980, all of the segments of our population were actually experiencing remarkable increases in prosperity. And from that point, what's happened is the emergence of the fabled 1% and the diagram that you see on the right, which has produced this extreme difference. This is, in turn, in a kind of vicious circle tied to the austerity agenda. And so you have these two images on the top. I like the one on the right, which says, I hate taxes, but I like schools, roads, firefighters, police officers, hospitals, paramedics, hazmat teams, et cetera, et cetera. We're tied to a terrible debate on this issue, which is crippling us. So all things public are under enormous stress just when we need them most, both hard and soft infrastructure that makes cities work. So just as we had come to that great new understanding of cities, we've basically had this tremendous undermining of our capacity to serve them. This has also been playing itself out in another phenomenon, which is segregation by geography, where because cities are now seen to be the places that are most desirable, and this has happened significantly in cities like Toronto, it is happening in other cities. This map produced by David Holchansky, who's a colleague at the University of Toronto, a demographer, shows a remarkable shift that occurred between 1970 and 2005, where red, which represents concentrations of poverty, was a so-called inner city phenomenon as late as 1970. You had that large pale yellow middle class, and then you had an upper class in the blue, which was outside the city of center. Well, 35 years later, there's been this total reversal where the people of the greatest means have moved into the places that are most desirable. Poverty is almost exclusively located now in the first-ring auto-oriented suburbs where people who have choice don't want to be. This is not only Toronto. Chicago has exactly the same pattern on the Gold Coast. And in fact, if you look at that little diagram on the left, what you're seeing is the crossing of these two curves where poverty is now becoming, not surprisingly, a suburban rather than an urban phenomenon. So back to my favorite mayor. I think you've all heard of him. When we had the election in Toronto, you've seen the red state, blue state, or red county, blue county maps. This is a map showing the polling stations in Toronto after the last election, which reflects the amalgamation of our city. And never mind who the candidates were, we have a really unhealthy political situation, which is caused by all the relates to all the phenomena I just described, where that dotted outline, which represents the pre-war city of Toronto, the 700,000 people in that pre-war city, voted almost entirely one way, and the 2/3 of the electorate living in those post-war suburbs, unhappy legitimately for a whole bunch of reasons, either because they'd placed their bet on a way of life that is now under terrible stress and no longer particularly attractive, or because they're living in poverty in an area without cars, where the only way to get around is with cars, voted the other way. This is not a healthy situation. It leads to another problem, and we are dealing with this as we sit here today. We have a provincial election which is going to take place next Thursday, and one of the main things that it's about is this. We have a terrible, terrible congestion problem. In 2001, it was already a $6 billion drag on the local economy. These diagrams were prepared, by the way, by the Board of Trade in Toronto to alarm us, to say that all those areas in blue were becoming unbearably congested and were really undermining our ability to progress and leading to some of the longest commute times in North America. And all of those revenue tools, as they're described on the bottom, are like a third rail for politicians who are currently running for the provincial government. Everybody's saying we need the transit. Everybody is terrified in light of the polarization, in light of the split in the electorate, to actually speak to forms of taxation that will pay for that necessary infrastructure. So this leads us to a terrible dilemma as we face aging mid-20th century highway infrastructure. So both in Montreal on top and Toronto below, we literally have falling concrete. You've had falling bridges in different parts of the US, and we don't have the resources. We're not giving ourselves the resources to deal with this properly. We still have, in your Congress and in our current federal government in Ottawa, a severe case of climate denial. climate change denial. So the floods in Calgary, this is the famous Stampede grounds back in 2013. We're seeing more and more severe events of this type, and yet we still have not summoned the political will to really deal with this in a serious way. So this leads me to the main point I wanted to share with you this evening, and that is to be really effective, urbanism now needs to engage with these complex and highly interrelated issues. So what we need is, to do this, is a big tent, unhyphenated urbanism. No disrespect to new urbanism, but in order to tap into the unique capacity of cities to act as crucibles in dealing with these really serious challenges that come from many different sources, internally and externally, we have to get out of silos and perceived dichotomies. So beyond new urbanism, post-urbanism, everyday urbanism, ecological urbanism, landscape urbanism, formal urbanism, informal urbanism, to use only part of the terms that have been spawned, simply urbanism is good enough, and it has to be a big enough tent to embrace all of these. They all have something to contribute, but none have a monopoly on the solutions. The challenges that we're facing, in fact, all intersect around the conjoined and indivisible urban project. The key enablers are governance, leadership, and resources. Some of the factors that are all interwoven have to do with the embrace of mix and diversity, which we're doing, making complete neighborhoods in all respects, changing how we move in cities, the revival of the commons, seeing cities as part of nature, and undertaking projects in areas of cities that actually embrace all of these and cause transformation to occur. On the job front, because that is an absolutely crucial issue in every election that's taking place now, we have to learn how to make the obsolescent areas of our cities more productive with new fusions of diverse activities, enterprises, ideas, and people. One of the most significant planning moves that took place in Toronto when Jane Jacobs was alive, and I had the privilege of working with her on this and with Mayor Barbara Hall at the time in the late 90s, was to get rid of land use zoning in 400 acres on the two shoulders of downtown in former industrial areas to allow all land uses to occur. And what this did is unleash billions of dollars of reinvestment in these former industrial buildings, such as you see here, and you can see the image on the right, all the new being inserted among the old. And this is a classic Jane Jacobs story. It has liberated thousands of individual efforts in old buildings and new buildings and synergies to develop through limited public intervention, but in fact a permission to allow these things to happen. And what's fascinating is in these two industrial areas, I don't expect you to read anything here, but on the right, the bar that drops below the line is the loss of manufacturing jobs, and all those bars that you see on the left are various new forms of economic activity. The amazing thing is with a huge increase of residential population, there are more people working in these industrial areas than ever did so during the height of the industrial era when these were all factory floors. We have to learn how to do more than one thing at a time. And this introduces a whole new calculus of combinations as we become denser. And if Walmart can do it, this is Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, if Walmart can figure out how to do a store in a residential building, then I think anyone can. We have to tap the capacities of an increasingly heterogeneous society. The image on the right is from a former distillery in Toronto, where the employees all lined themselves up against the wall and took this group photo, and they're all white males. The people who work there today in what is now called the distillery, for fun, did the same photograph. And if you look at the differences in terms of gender, ethnicity, age, it's incredible how the workforce has changed. We need to embrace inclusion of our society. Naheed Nenshi, who is one of our best mayors in Canada, the mayor of Calgary, and a great urbanist, symbolizes that outreach to all segments of our population, leading the Gay Pride Parade. We have to find ways to think of cities not just for the able-bodied 20 to 50-year-olds, but for the children, for the seniors, for people who have various forms of physical limitation. We have to tap the resources and the skills of all of those populations. We have to break out of isolated enclaves. This is Regent Park, a great public housing project from the late 1940s in Toronto, early 1950s, that is more than doubling the population, becoming a phenomenal mixed-income, mixed-use neighborhood. But very importantly, as we do this, is the need for common ground for diverse populations. Where do we gather eyeball to eyeball on sidewalks, in public spaces? Do we see each other as opposed to passing each other in our automobiles behind several thousand pounds of steel? And this operates at every level. And this is a wonderful tale I want to tell you. In the city of Brampton, which is one of those 905 cities, there was, and this is very unusual in Canada, a group distributed the racist poster that you see on the left, which speaks to the changing face of Brampton and says, is this what you really want? Showing a mob scene of Sikhs in India. Brampton has a very large South Asian population. This was a terrible gesture to have come forward. It really upset people, but the response came from the high school students in Brampton who produced the poster on the right. And they took a picture of themselves, which you see in the lower image, under that cutout template of unity, saying, yes, this is what we really want. And why this is so powerful, why this could happen, is those kids coming from all over the world actually go to school together. Without that common ground, without that meeting place, they would not have been able to produce that response. We have to change how we move in the city. Obviously, this is one of the biggest challenges, and we're seeing literally the eruption of cycling and walking. We have to avail ourselves of all the new means, high-tech and low-tech. Who would have imagined that the bicycle would reemerge as a major form of transportation in the 21st century, that cars would be things that you use but not own, that we'd be using our handheld devices in myriad ways to pay for and navigate around the city. That we have to learn to change the nature, the physiognomy of all of our streets. This is a project I've been working on in Ottawa, from what you see on the upper right to streets that have all those characteristics that we see on the bottom. And Ottawa has now committed itself to transforming the entirety of its downtown streets, and I was interested to hear from Mayor Brown that there's a similar plan in Buffalo. We have to change our relationship to the natural world, and that's where I think the bigger tent for urbanism becomes so important. You should not in any way see landscape urbanism as something which is a threat to new urbanism. These are hand and glove. And it is absolutely crucial in addressing climate change in a serious way. This is an issue of transforming the land, transforming the topography, dealing with hydrology. We have to learn about the green economy. British Columbia actually introduced a carbon tax, which produced a 17.4% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And contrary to all the alarmist things that were said, British Columbia's economy slightly outpaced the rest of the country. We have to make that move, and I was really pleased. Thank you, President Obama. Along with this comes an altered image of place, which includes natural process. These are from Portland, which has done an amazing job in introducing stormwater management as a beautiful working feature in city streets. We need to take all these thoughts not only to the city, but to the city region. So these are 3 policies in the province of Ontario which are making all the difference as they weave together. One is the Green Belt, which starts with nature, identifies a vast area to be protected, within which there's a growth plan, which directs growth, but the growth plan is wired to something called the Big Move, which is a multi-billion-dollar annual investment in transportation infrastructure. So we need new alliances, new tools, new techniques, and seen in this light, unhyphenated urbanism is the dynamic, interactive, perpetually unfinished synthesis of all of these elements. We become, in effect, as urbanists, the specialists of the in-between. We cross disciplinary silos, contract limits, property lines, and political boundaries. We're talking about the city we see from the air and experience on the ground. This is an example. John mentioned my work with Michael van Valkenburg. This is typically the team setting in which we work, where we have people from every conceivable profession around the table, a flattening of the hierarchies. Good ideas come from any part of the team. It's an iterative process, and that's the only way to work on these complex problems. So the competition that we won for the Lower Donlands in Toronto could not have been done by a less inclusive team of urbanists. If you want to tackle floodproofing, decontamination, new infrastructure, transportation, renaturalization of the waterfront, a new park system, mixed-use development, connecting new and existing neighborhoods, you need those many voices and many insights around the table. We have to reach outside our professions, looking upstream and downstream to urban change agents, politicians, civil servants, community groups, individuals, companies, entrepreneurs, developers, planners, design professionals, all of whom make key contributions. This is a group that my wife Etty and I are on the board of in Toronto called Park People, which represents the 1,600 parks in Toronto and all the Friends of and Conservancy groups, which has become a powerful voice for common ground, for the public realm. Sometimes it's political leadership at the top, and that political leadership at different times in the life of a city has to do many things. Sometimes these things come bottom up, as this community group played a key role in a rail-to-trail transformation. We have to learn to try things out, to not be afraid of doing things that don't require long and complicated environmental impact statements and enable us, like what New York City did from 23rd Street up to Columbus Circle, to try out this work on Broadway, or what we did on Yonge Street in Toronto, where we discovered just by taking over a lane of traffic that the businesses experienced a 40% uptake. There is also just the painstaking work of consistent change at the margin. This is Boston University, where I've been working, where over time, auto use has been steadily decreasing, public transit has been increasing, along with walking and biking, through specific moves like the transformation of Commonwealth Avenue. Sometimes we get a chance, like the Big Dig in Boston and the Crossroads project that I worked on with Mayor Menino, to look at the very big picture, but very often it's the small incremental gestures that make the difference. So what we're seeing in city after city around the world is those cities that are most successful, that are the trailblazers, are the ones that manage to put all of these themes together. It's not multiple choice. You have to address all of them. Urbanism is not an option. It's not a lifestyle choice. What is at stake is nothing more and nothing less than our future as a species on the planet. As we have gone past 50% of global residents now living in cities, over 80% in North America. This is where we have to solve problems. If we don't do it here, we will not do it. Another colleague of mine, Chris Turner, who is an energy analyst in Calgary, has written a terrific book called The Leap. And he argues that the most vital project of the 21st century is a shift from our unsustainable way of life to a sustainable one, a great lateral leap, and he literally means from one speeding freight train to another, from a track headed for economic and ecological disaster to one bound for renewed prosperity. It can't simply be top-down. We have to make these critical changes democratically in new political space that reflects how we actually live in cities. And we as urbanists have to take part in that political discourse. There are reasons, I believe, you have to be an optimist to do this, for thinking that big change does happen. And if you look at these great movements, civil rights, the women's movement, gender equality, the gay rights, LGBT rights, and changing our habits with respect to smoking. These enormous changes do happen. And I want to end with this postscriptum, which is a quote from a white paper produced by Thomas Mulcair, who's the leader of the official opposition in Canada. There are actually, I'm not advocating for one party or another, there are actually two parties in Ottawa who could have said much the same thing as we start to acknowledge where the 85% of the constituents actually live. But I think this says it very poignantly. Our starting point is recognition that Canada is a predominantly urban nation, one of the most urbanized nations in the world. We therefore have a national interest in the success of our cities. There can be no national vision without a vision for our cities, no national project without an urban project, no national agenda without an urban agenda. The white paper will lay out our expression of what it means to be an urban nation and will set out the implications of the urban fact for federal policy and governance. Wouldn't it be great if we could get there? Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Ken, for that inspiring speech and challenging speech and discussion of the new word, which I'll leave to Lynn to worry about that. I know Todd Zimmerman is here somewhere, and he's one of the board members for many years, pounded the table and said we should drop the new word. But it didn't happen. But you are right, urbanism can unite us, and CNU is certainly a big part of that. We're very proud of our work in that effort. All right, so now there's a reception, and then for those of you, like most CNU participants, most new urbanists, of course, the work just goes on, and so at 8 o'clock at the Buffalo Sabres hockey place, in the Lexus room, which is sort of a room that's part of there's a lecture that will happen there with Andres Dwani and Emily Talon entitled Their General Theory of Urbanism. And so if instead of relaxing and sitting around and doing nothing, you can go to work later tonight at 8 o'clock. The speech will probably happen a little bit later, so you could be a few minutes late. And right now you can enjoy yourself in the back of the room, and Ken and Ellen and I and Lynn and all that, we're all going to be hanging back there. Doug Farr will be there. Thank you very much, and CNU 22 is off to a start. Thank you.